Hello, Dave Dugan.
Hello, Lynn Power.
The last time I saw Dave Dugan, he worked in an agency. So you can only imagine the questions I have for you now.
Yes, I'm ready. I'm ready.
Don't worry, it won't be like Barbara Walters. So where I thought we'd start is to talk about the consumer. We'll get into Facebook, don't worry. Plenty of opportunities to talk about all the things you guys do. But I wanted to actually kind of take a 60,000-foot approach into consumer behavior, because you guys know this stuff and you have access to insights and data and ways to look at the way consumers are spending their time. And can you just share with us kind of the latest, greatest?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the biggest important theme that we see is probably not a surprise, but is the use of mobile. And sort of writ large, we think a lot about where consumers are spending their time across channels. There's some e-marketing data that we start most of our client presentations with that looks at the time that an average American spends each day by different channel. And we've got the data that goes back to the 50s to present day, and it's fascinating. So imagine these lines that show here's time spent on radio, television, digital, and then mobile as a subset of digital. And basically you look for where those lines cross or where one channel starts to beat the other. Until last year, the last time that one channel crossed another was in the 50s when television overtook radio. Yep. That was the last time that there was a switch. According to eMarketer last year, it was the first time that time spent on digital exceeded time spent on TV. And the data is astonishing. So any guesses, average US citizen, time spent per day watching television programming in the back? Very close, 4.5 hours a day. I'm not sure where people get time to do this, but yeah, it's truth.
Multitasking.
So 4.5 hours on TV compared to 5 hours and 15 minutes on digital, and digital combined, including mobile. So what we're seeing now is 2 hours of that time is from mobile. That's up an hour over the prior year. So if you look at the curve of that mobile growth, it's astonishing. So I think whether you're in PR, in media, in publishing, that's the biggest trend that we're all facing right now, is how to optimize for that growth in mobile.
So talking about mobile, I've had 2 clients in the last week talk about how mobile is the most important screen right now. And they basically said to us, we want to see creative work presented first in mobile, which I think is interesting because it just talks to sort of how different the world is that we have to adapt to. How is Facebook responding to this?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So I think first of all, we believe that great storytelling hasn't changed. So in terms of wonderful creative that captures people's imaginations, no difference if you're watching it on a small screen or on a big screen. But I think sometimes people assume that within Facebook, our shift to mobile has been easy, and it hasn't. So you may find this interesting. If you looked at our revenue that was coming from the mobile channel in 2011, and we're a Menlo Park-based technology company, in 2011, the percent of our revenue that was from mobile advertising was 0. Last quarter was 59%. So to go from 0 to 59% of our business, it's a pretty astonishing change in about 3 years. And I think it really required a cultural change from the top. So Mark Zuckerberg still incredibly focused on our product experience. All new product updates go through Zuckerberg. He started a rule about 1.5 years ago, which was if an engineering team, a product development team came in to review a new feature on Facebook, and you showed up with a comp or a prototype that was designed for a laptop screen, so 4x3, is it landscape or portrait? That's wider. Landscape. If you showed up with that landscape view, meeting was over, kicked you out, and said, come back when you've got a mobile prototype. So he literally did that. And there are a couple of these reviews with Zuckerberg that the meeting's over, all of a sudden word spreads in the company that, don't make that mistake. Yep. It's awkward and embarrassing.
Yep.
So now all product design is led from that mobile experience first. Obviously, desktop is still important to us, but we start with that innovation from mobile first.
Okay, interesting. So let's talk a little bit about targeting on Facebook, because clearly you can get very, very precision targeted, but how does that match up with creativity and ability to kind of marry creative expression with different audiences?
Right. I think there was some good conversation earlier about the role that television plays versus digital. And I think one theme that we see is great television spots play very well on digital channels, whether it's Facebook or other media. I'd like to show an example that was Coca-Cola's Super Bowl spot from this most recent Super Bowl. It's beautiful work done by Wyden and Kennedy. Quick setup before we roll it is that this is work that was done, and many of us have been through this world, brief written in advance, the work was prepared, this output was ready. They brought us this output pretty shortly before the Super Bowl and said, what can we do on Facebook to make this even more optimized? Let's roll the spot and then we'll talk for a bit.
Oh, beautiful for spacious skies, por tus olas de granos d'amber, yo piscinat sa kote, sa ibabaw ng mga prutas. America, America, God shed His grace on thee. और वही चरे के साथ ताज तेरा चा, de la mer à la mer brillant. Berate verrière tirotard, from sea to shining sea.
Nice work.
So really beautiful work by Wyden and Kennedy. This is a room full of PR experts. This runs during the first half of the Super Bowl. What happens in part online after this runs? Controversy from some pockets of the world that are, I don't know how you describe it, conservative or negative or evil. But you put a beautiful story out there and negativity starts to happen. So it's probably sad and disappointing, but not surprising. And our clients at Coke knew that there was some risk of this happening with this kind of story. So they approached us pretty shortly before the Super Bowl and said, we've got this beautiful work. We know that there are different ways that we can use targeting and use profile data to do something special with this work. Facebook, can you help us think this through? So basically the answer that we landed on was creating 19 different versions of this spot, not going through and doing a heavy post-production edit on the creative, but thinking about 19 different audiences, a lot of which were reflected in this spot, taking one still frame image from somewhere in the spot that spoke to that audience, having a text overlay on that first frame, and then using our profile data on Facebook to serve this spot in a targeted way to those individual audiences. So Arab Americans, the LGBT community, US Hispanic, that they did a buy on Facebook, serve these ads. You see that first image that speaks to your personal interest or background. And something really fascinating happened, which was if you looked at the sharing behavior or the positive commentary that came from people that received those targeted spots on Facebook, where you've got known identity. So you go into Facebook, you make a comment, it's your name, your social graph sees it. The positivity that came from those spots versus the negative commentary that came from sort of anonymous social media sources where it's like scribbling graffiti. You're not accountable to it because it's anonymous. Really fascinating to see the differences between those two. So I find it a fascinating example of sort of managing a proactive PR message in a really positive way that got this wonderful commentary and got people coming back. We then followed up for people that watched this spot, that interacted with it, about a week after the Super Bowl to keep the conversation going. We had a behind the scenes sort of making of a spot that then followed up. So I think the best work that we're doing now is in partnership with agencies to say, let's take that special targeting that we can do and rather just pump one single message out to America. Let's slice and dice that in an interesting way.
No, really good. So you talked about being proactive, and in our sort of nanosecond culture, right, which we all talk about, how can we think about that differently? How can we create content so that we're thinking ahead? I mean, the Super Bowl happens every year, right? The Oscars happen every year. Like, how can we be planning more aggressively for the things that could happen and have content ready to go?
Right. I think there's a really interesting combination of, thinking about sort of the long-term structure of a brand and all the investment that we make in it. What's the center or the core of that brand, and then using opportunistic marketing along the way to sort of supplement that and take advantage, but doing those two things in combination. Yeah. So one example that I really like, I'm not sure if anyone from Digitas is in the room. Digitas did some fascinating work with P&G for Tide around lots of different work for Tide, but there's one in particular called Tide Loads of Hope. And the idea was in areas that suffered natural disasters, so floods, earthquakes, mudslides, things like that. One of the real issues is you're out of your home, you're trying to take care of your family, clean clothes are an issue. Basically came up with this sort of mobile unit with a truck and some vans that had laundry equipment in them that could pump out like 300 loads of laundry a day. So this awesome thing, obviously you need to get the message out about something wonderful like that. So they basically created this newsroom called Brand Live, where they had creative team, technologists together to think about what are these opportunities with sort of day-to-day events to use to promote that. And then there were some fun things that happened. So Daytona 500 in 2012, basically crash happens, there's fuel spilled on the track. Apparently they use powdered Tide detergent as a device to like sponge up the fuel on a track. This is a known thing that happens. But all of a sudden, what a cool story to promote the usage of Tide. Tide saves the day for the Daytona 500, and it's
very
on.
Timely, yep.
But the fact that they had the right resources and the right team watching the data, seeing what the chatter was, that took a ton of effort and resource and pre-planning to be ready for something like that. So we love seeing stories of agencies like that who are really thinking about making the use of data, but also not getting like so twisted and turned by a current event to get away from the core brand, keeping true to the spirit of that long-term planning.
So do you have any examples for a lot of the PR folks in the room about sort of brands dealing with crisis management, and taking what you just said and applying it there?
Yeah, I think it's probably table stakes now, whether it's ourselves at Facebook or Twitter or other platforms of using us as a big scale mechanism to get the word out. So I think taking that right message, pumping it out to a large audience, it's obvious, it makes sense, it's low cost. I think some of the cooler executions I've seen with this sort of crisis management is back to the targeting piece. We call it custom audiences, which is our lingo for taking profile data and serving targeted messages. We've seen some energy companies do some interesting things. So Shell, for instance, when there were those recent mudslides in the state of Washington, they think a lot about their sort of local involvement. Somebody posted a message on Facebook saying, wow, what a difficult time. Wouldn't it be cool if fuel cards were given out to people who were affected in this area? They're on it, they're quick, and they publish a message out targeted pretty geographically specifically to people in that affected area. Not that that's a message that you wouldn't push out nationally, but I think brands like that are thinking, okay, what are specific regions, segments, targets that you want to get that message to? Another example of a retailer who knew that there were certain DMAs in the country that sentiment was more negative than in other parts of the country, saying, okay, let's get our message, let's use Facebook targeting, and let's get proactive messaging out in those areas, and then doing interesting things with test and control to see, all right, what's the difference if population A sees that message and population B does not? There was just a mention previously about political campaigns. I think the same thing. Maybe it's not geographic, but thinking about people that have certain interests or certain profiles, and everybody's got scarce budgets. Instead of just doing a thin layer of peanut butter out to everybody, how do you pick those audiences that are most important to reach?
Makes a lot of sense. Okay, so as an agency person, I have to ask a question that, I don't know, maybe some of you are thinking, but I certainly did, which is, Dave's my friend, but you're kind of a frenemy now because you're at Facebook. And let's face it, you can go to my clients and they're talking to you and you can give them solutions and ideas. And how do we as agency people have a seat at the table and make sure that we're part of these conversations or driving the conversations or leading the conversations?
So we're not evil, we're partners.
Yes.
I would say a couple of things. One is for the vast majority of our business, if you take away small business, so we have got a lot of restaurants, barbershops, coffee shops that do advertising, they're using self-service tools directly with us.
Yep.
With very few other exceptions, there are probably a couple of gaming clients, some big e-commerce clients, maybe like Amazon. Everybody else has agencies that are critical to their choices about how they plan and buy Facebook. So agencies are critical to our growth.
Yep.
To the point that my role, I sit in a global agency team. I spend 100% of my time focusing exclusively on agencies. I happen to serve WPP. but we have staff against each of the global holding companies, and our exclusive purpose is to figure out how do we build tools, how do we provide insights, how do we have creative resources, so that for the important agency teams, whether it's creative or media, we make it easier to plan and buy Facebook. I think as a company, we haven't always been easy to work with. It hasn't always been simple in terms of how we publish our product sets.
Yep.
We did some research and looked back at our product offering deck a couple of years ago, and it's basically this like 37-page manual of all these obscure product names and what's the difference between a page post and a sponsored post. And we said, well, wait a second, for the agency teams that are working hard to buy on Facebook, we need to simplify. So if you think about the resource that we have now versus 2 years ago and the importance that agencies play for us,
Yep.
we probably had maybe 3 or 4 global agency people 2 years ago. We now have over 20. And then in country, we probably had about 20 people 2 years ago, and now we've got over 100 out in market. So we've really invested in this resource to try to make it easier for agencies to call us and do work together.
Okay, so you've
Did
got
that suitably persuade you that we're not
you're
your
getting
enemy?
there. You're getting there. So you've got the resources, you've got the people, but as an agency person, when do I engage you? When do I call you? What kind of things do I bring you in to do? Can you help me be a thought leader? Just share a little bit of how we use you.
Right. So hopefully most creative agency or media agency people in the room know who their contact at Facebook is, and there's regular dialogue there. If you don't, I can help people in this audience figure that out. But I would put it into a few different buckets. So at the holding company level, for Omnicom, for Publicis, for WPP, for Havas, for IPG, we've got formal dedicated resource, and there should be a really clear map of who to call for what. If that's not clear to anyone in that category, let me know. I can help with that. For smaller agencies, we think a lot about how we create sort of self-service tools, have really good online content, and try to make it easy, for anyone to access resources. So hopefully that content is easy to find. Facebook.com/business is where that resource lives. And if it's not clear for anybody, I'm happy to talk afterwards. I think in addition to the people, what we're trying to think about is what are the tools or the resources that we build because we've got cool access to this stuff and give it back to the agency community to use. So you mentioned at the beginning sort of this perception that we've got this data. We do have a lot of data. It's not always in the easiest format to use. We've recognized that, and we're trying to now build tools that make it easier for planners or creative teams to get insights about what people are doing on Facebook.
Yeah, I mean, do you have examples, if you've even done this, I don't know, where you've really partnered with an agency on some technology or innovation solutions or ideas?
Yeah, I think we've had some betas in the works for the last year or so. There's a tool we just launched last week called the Audience Insights tool, which we're slowly rolling out. It's starting in the US, which is what we typically do, make sure it works, make sure it can handle the scale loads that come in, and then we'll expand that eventually globally. So it's not rolled out to everyone yet. But as one example, what we can do is take insights of a fan base from one individual brand and then look at what's their profile data look like, what are they commenting on, what other brands are they interested in. Hopefully brands use that to figure out how to optimize their Facebook presence, but the goal is put those insights out there so that you can think about insights broadly, whether that's television creative or print or a PR message. So we're really trying harder to create these tools that agencies can use, get insights from the data that we have, and then use that for broader planning purposes.
So what's next for Facebook?
That's a broad question. I think for anyone that uses our services, you've probably noticed that we've got a lot more sort of individual apps for people to use. So, Facebook, the big blue core app, is still our main thing where users spend the bulk of their time. But you're probably starting to notice things like Facebook Messenger, which has always been embedded within the core Facebook app, is now at a scale with enough user base that it's a standalone app. Instagram was independent. We acquired it.
Yep.
We vowed to keep that as a both separate consumer experience, but also a separate team that runs that within Facebook. WhatsApp is an acquisition that's in process. It hasn't cleared regulation yet. We're optimistic it will. So I think what you're seeing is a recognition that different people have different use cases for each of these different tools, And rather than trying to mash it all into one sort of monolithic app with hundreds and hundreds of features, having these individual experiences. So that's sort of the near term. And then I think one of the benefits of being a company like Facebook is, we've got a visionary leader in Zuckerberg who's thinking about what's 10 years out, not what's 2 years out. So an acquisition like Oculus is fascinating on the belief that there are going to be technologies that are really immature now that will be very important in the future. And Oculus is an awesome example of one of those, the way that you interact with visual data in an immersive experience. We've now got the resources to think about how technologies like that will evolve. I think it's important to mention that the percent of our staff that works on that 10-plus year-out stuff is a very small, probably less than 1% of our company. But we think really important for both consumers and marketers that we've got a couple experiments like that that are way out into the future.
Fun. Okay, I think we're going to open it up for questions. So anyone? You covered a lot.
There must be some questions. Yes, Carly.
Okay, hold on. You guys are bad at taking directions. You're not raising your hand, and you're not using the microphone. You would fuss at your people for that.
Anyway, so I was just saying today is Mark Zuckerberg's 30th birthday. So I was just curious in regards to him, what your take is on how he's been involved in the brand and upholding the brand messaging, and obviously just what he thinks about it and what you really value about him.
Yeah, it's so fun and fascinating as an employee to see how he communicates as a leader. So just a couple of examples. Every Friday, unless he's traveling, we do an all-staff Q&A where he gets into a cafeteria like this, stands up with the microphone, gives an update, takes open Q&A, any topic is open. So I think that's sort of point one is like his openness of communicating what he believes is important and taking input and questions is sort of theme one. I think theme two is we just celebrated our 10th anniversary as a company. And the main theme of sort of celebrating that anniversary was shipping love to our users, whether they be consumers or to agencies or to our technology partners, and really spending more time thinking about what are experiences that would delight each of those groups, and making sure that any kind of product enhancement, any new development that we're doing is something that, whether you're a user or an agency or a partner, you would receive that and say, that helps me, that helps my business, that helps me do my thing better. And that's really his challenge to the organization, which is for any of us in any of the roles that we're playing, how do you deliver that love to those individual audiences? And I think the Facebook Audience Insights tool that I mentioned, that's a great example for the agency community, which is we've got this privilege of scale. How do we create tools that are helpful to that ecosystem? Is that helpful? Yeah.
Hey, quick question.
Yes.
Actually, two questions. The data you said, it's Mike Learmonth at Advertising Age. Thanks for your time. It was very interesting. The data you said at the outset, the 2 hours versus 5 hours, what's your source on that?
That was eMarketer data from summer of last year.
Okay.
So I'm sure that delta has even increased since that was published, 9, 10 months ago.
Sure. I'm wondering, it being upfront season, you have this product in the market that's, very conducive to TV advertisers, the video ads. Are you selling those up front, or are there any activity in the upfront market for Facebook?
Yeah, so for people who aren't familiar, we've always had click-to-play video ads on Facebook. So you've probably seen them if you're a user of Facebook. You scroll through your news feed, there'll be a unit with a triangle. You click that triangle, it plays it. So we've had that product for a while. We've just launched a product called Premium Video, which is basically autoplay. So as you're scrolling through your news feed, that video unit pops up. We're doing what we call a focused release of that. We've had a couple of tests with Summit Entertainment and Progressive Insurance ran last week. So it's going to be a focused release. We're learning as we go. We're really excited about that opportunity. I would say it's something that clients and advertisers have been asking out a lot in terms of if they've got video assets, looking for more options and new ways to present that content. So we believe it's really important. I think one thing we've learned as a company is to make sure we make those experiences absolutely perfect. So you'll see more of them, whether you're agency side or as a consumer. And we've had great reaction to them so far. I think the observation we see from consumers is consumers are generally very happy to see ads on Facebook, so long as they're relevant and they're targeted. And I think the primary thing that we're facing is how do we make sure that we're using our data and sort of doing the right matchmaking so that if it's relevant. And as a user, if you've ever seen something that speaks to your personal interests, so I like to run, I like to exercise, if I see something from that category from a small brand that pops up in my news feed, like that's pretty cool for me as a user. So I think that video product aligns to the same theme of making sure that it's targeted quite well to the right audience, which is something that we think we can do much more strongly than sort of a broader television network.
So acknowledging that Facebook has shareholders and has to make money, but changing the algorithm so that the free media days are basically going away. What is your recommendation or thought in terms of like smaller brands that don't necessarily have big ad budgets or can't really afford to use things, or even just something like my own agency, for example, where we're not necessarily likely to pay for an ad for ourselves, but we want to continue to get reach and scale of all of our own posts and things like that, and like finding the algorithms going against us now.
Right. So yeah, that's been a frequent topic of conversation, I would say, in the last 6-9 months especially, of this sort of organic reach discussion. 2 comments. One is if just some context on why that's happening. On any given day, our algorithm is looking at, on average, 1,500 items that we could put into the typical user's newsfeed. If we served all of those 1,500, you'd have so much clutter that it would basically break our product experience. You wouldn't be satisfied with it. So what we're doing is taking those 1,500 and picking roughly the 300 or so that we think are most relevant to you based on your interests. And I think what that means is if you're a brand, you're competing for relevance up against your friend Lynn, who's in your news feed, or public figures that you follow, or your favorite sports team, or a post from a brand that you like. So I think all that comes down to relevance. So one is, more than ever, relevant creative, relevant targeting is important of thinking about what your core audience is looking for. I think our other piece of advice is thinking about the business objectives that you're trying to drive versus just social metrics. I think as an industry, there is this thing that happened a few years ago, which was optimizing creative to get a like.
Yeah.
And you've all seen these ads, like if you like this kitten, this cute image, like this ad. So that might drive certain metrics in terms of likes or engagement, but it doesn't necessarily do anything for the brand or for the business objectives that you're trying to push. So our advice is always thinking about, it's not necessarily likes or comments, that's one metric, but what's the broader thing that you're trying to drive with the right targeted audience? And I would say even for brands that have very small budgets, really, really small targeted buys are surprisingly effective at reaching the right kind of influencers that you're trying to go after.
All right, if that's all the questions, thank you so much for being here. Great job, we really appreciate it. And I know so when we made the decision to make the